Good afternoon and welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is David Gray and I direct the Workforce and Family Program as well as our Religious Center initiative. It's my pleasure to invite you to today's event, How Expanding Flexibility in the Workplace Supports Religious Americans. We remain grateful for the support and leadership of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation in its work in this important field. Attention toward the field of workplace flexibility reached new prominence last week with President Obama and the First Lady hosting a forum on workplace flexibility. It's an exciting development to have the White House focused on the need of Americans to expand the flexibility that employees have in their workplace. And one reason why flexibility is so important in the 21st century is because of the increasing diversity of the American workforce, including religious diversity. Millions of Americans struggle with work-life balance, as you all know, and as most of us experience personally. Many strive to be successful at work, but see a mismatch between the requirements of their faith and the structure of the workplace. Others find that the structure of work in our 24/7 economy does not allow for sufficient spiritual health. And so our purpose today is to discuss this mismatch between the needs of workers, particularly with a religious observance affiliation, and flexibility in the structure of work in America, and perhaps to discuss what we may do about it to increase such flexibility. Today we are very pleased to be joined by 6 experts in the field. Their biographies are available outside, but to just introduce briefly, Katie Corrigan, who is the Director of Workplace Flexibility 2010 at Georgetown Law; Richard Fulton, Director of National and Legislative Affairs in the Office of Government and International Affairs of the American Jewish Committee; Nathan Diamond, who is the Director of Public Policy at the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America; Amardeep Singh, the Director of Programs at the Sikh Coalition; Mary Busey, who is the Director of Legislative Affairs at the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists; and Zainab Al-Suwaij, who is the Executive Director of the American Islamic Congress. I appreciate you all being here today. I know we had rescheduled this from a date in which it was absolutely terrible weather in February when the snowstorm was upon us, and now we have absolutely beautiful weather. And so we have, I appreciate you taking the time to be here. I also thank all those who are watching this over the web as we webcast this live, and many had indicated they were going to watch it from their desks. We are going to have each speaker speak for maybe 8 to 10 minutes about the state of workplace flexibility, about mismatches they see between the needs of workers both generally and perhaps in particular communities, and the structure of work, and then about what America might do to increase the flexibility of our workplace for the benefit of all Americans, with an eye in particularly towards those for which religious observance is important. Then I look forward to your questions and your insights as well. So thanks again for joining us today, and I would invite Katie Corrigan to deliver first remarks. Katie?
And thanks so much to David for organizing this event. He's been a really great ally of ours on these issues. So I'm Katie Corrigan, Director of a project at Georgetown Law School called Workplace Flexibility 2010. And I think my job this afternoon is to really give you just a bit of context for what you'll hear after me. Our project was formed about 6 years ago, and our goal was really to make workplace flexibility a compelling national issue. It's something when I would go and first start talking to people about this, the foundation, the Sloan Foundation that funds us, and also David Gray, had funded all of this research, something like $100 million of academic research on work and family. And they had sociologists and demographers and economists and lots of different disciplines looking at the intersection of those two things in society. And the thing they kept surfacing is something that certainly I know, and I think a lot of us in the room know, our viewers know. There's this mismatch, as David talked about, between how the workplace is structured and the needs that we have as a workforce in modern America. There's lots and lots of fact sheets on our website and lots of data out there, but just the story goes, dual earner couples and families are the norm. That's the way it is now. It wasn't that way 30 years ago. There are lots of single parents out there. Older workers, we're all living a lot longer. We're going to be working a lot longer. We're going to have to work in new and different ways. And even something that was really surfaced in last week's White House conversation on these issues, the new economy demands that we get retrained, reskilled, retooled. That requires some flexibility in our current job to prepare for that next job ahead. So there's lots of different reasons why flexibility is important. But I think one of the challenges I faced working on these issues is it's often the undercurrent of the conversation. It's not the headline, but rather it's in the background. But again, when you think about that background, it's often the foundation, the fiber. I've tried to come up with lots of different metaphors for it. But it's that thing that we needed to surface in order to have a conversation about in the public policy realm. So what our project has done over the last 6 years is try and surface the issue. One of the things that lawyers do is think about categories. There's a lot of kind of logic and analysis, and it's saying, okay, well, what is workplace flexibility? So the first thing we did was really define it so that we could actually have a public policy conversation about it. And we came up with 3 buckets. Flexible work arrangements, so day-to-day scheduling needs. How do you make your schedule work for your life? We also include time off. Things come up in your life where you're actually going to need to step out of the workplace, maybe for a day because your kid is sick, maybe a little longer because you've just had a child or adopted, or maybe you have to take care of an aging relative. So we look at time off. And then we also include a 3rd bucket that we call career flexibility, that there will be times in life where you may step out of the workforce altogether and you'll want to get back in gracefully. And that may, again, be for caregiving reasons, I think, is one of the most obvious. So first, we really tried to define the field. So what are we talking about? Second, we wanted to create more grooves and avenues of conversation. We don't think this is an issue for one party or one type of person. Again, there are lots of different subject matters that we're talking about here, and what we're trying to surface is this background noise on flexibility. So we've also tried to bring lots of relevant players to the table, and that's where our work with David Gray here at New America has been so important, and I think this panel is an example of it. That when we think about these different issues, certainly faith is part of that conversation. And faith is certainly about the spirit, about things we can't see. It also at times is very, very practical. And it's about how do you make time in your schedule for the Sabbath? How do you make time in your schedule for that family dinner? And flexibility, again, is in the background of some of those conversations. And so I think that last week, one thing that we were obviously excited about, it's always good when the White House holds a forum on workplace flexibility, if your workplace flexibility 2010. So we were happy about that just for lots of reasons that were very parochial and unique to us. But really what I thought was so powerful was you had both the president and the first lady talk about their personal experience, but they made their personal experience an experience that's not dissimilar to so many people in America. They made that personal experience very, very public. And again, when I think about trying to surface these issues from the background, putting a name on it, defining some categories, bringing the right people into the room to have the conversation, and then really broadcasting it across America. I feel like what the White House did last week was really trigger the beginning of a national conversation on issues that often haven't been front and center, and yet are so integrated into our daily lives and so there for us. So last week they had talked about caregiving was a big topic. They talked about the need for people to have job training and be skilled in the new economy. One thing that wasn't squarely mentioned is this issue around faith and spiritual practice. So I really look forward to this as kind of David picking up on this very, I thought, welcome invitation from the White House to start talking about these issues, start talking about how the public and private sector can work together to make work for more people. One thing, I come from a disability rights background, and in disability there's this concept of universal design, so that you make a building, for example, accessible to everyone. If you build a ramp, lots of people can go up, whether they are walking on their legs or using a wheelchair or pushing a stroller with a little kid in it. If you build steps, you've almost structured the building to create a barrier for some types of people. So universal design is about building more ramps. And I look at workplace flexibility as very much in that theme of creating a universal workplace where lots of different needs are dealt with, and that ramp is built from the beginning rather than always having to ask for an exception to a rule. Make flexibility the rule. So I really look forward to the conversation today, and I will keep my remarks short because I'm actually interested to hear from the rest of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And the personal stories matter so much in this area. In my own context, as both a parent and as someone who preached Easter Sunday at the church that I pastor, it's nice now to be on the other side of that as well. But it brings home in my own sort of religious context the need for flexibility in that in my personal life as I try to balance my work with raising two boys. And now I'd like to invite Richard Fulton, who's been a leader on these issues as well, to come forward. Richard?
Thank you, David, and thank you for putting on this program to the New America Foundation. I'm really pleased to have this topic of religious accommodation and religious place in the workplace framed in the context of workplace flexibility. I do very much agree that the issues of religious accommodation must have a place at the table when we're trying to deal with employees as whole people who should be able to address their various needs and obligations at the same time that they fulfill their obligations to their employer, and who should be accorded respect for essential aspects of their identities, which of course religion forms for faithful people, people of faith rather, that core part of their identity, which they should not be required as a matter of principle to leave at the workplace door when they report for work. Although it was not originally planned this way, as we've already heard, we were going to be meeting, if we had met on the day originally planned, it would have been under about 30 inches of snow. This forum is taking place, perhaps appropriately, within 2 days of the closing of the Jewish holiday of the spring, Pesach or Passover. And during that holiday, as at other times of year, there are a number of days on which work is religiously prescribed. This year especially so, since 4 of the days of Passover happen to be days on which work is prescribed, fell on weekdays, giving us, from however you look at it, far too little or too much time for religious celebration. So too often, when that happens, when you have the coming together of a holiday which has to be observed on weekdays and which for people of certain faiths cannot work, too often what should be a season of joy becomes, for some Jews in this case, because of the prescription on work for some of them, a period of anxiety, even of blighted careers, as they face the possibility of losing their livelihood or following the dictates of their faith. Now, one might well ask, why is this a problem in 2010? We're talking about workplace flexibility 2010. After all, in 1972, Congress amended the Civil Rights Act of 1964 so as to define as a form of religious discrimination the failure of an employer to reasonably accommodate an employee's religious observance unless such accommodation would impose an undue hardship on the employer's business. And in doing that, Congress properly recognized that the arbitrary refusal of an employer to accommodate an employee's religious practice is in effect a form of discrimination. So that should have been the end of it. They passed a law in 1972, people get accommodated. Well, we know that's not the end of the story, because unfortunately that standard, although appropriate on its face, has been interpreted by the Supreme Court and the lower courts in a fashion that makes it exceedingly difficult to enforce an employer's obligation to provide religious accommodation. And this constricted reading is no small matter. For many religiously observant Americans, the greatest peril to their ability to carry out their religious faith on a day-to-day basis is when they come into the workplace. As we will hear from my colleagues on this in this program, in too many cases, employees who want to do a good job are faced with employers who will not make a reasonable accommodation for observance of the Sabbath or other holy days, or employers who refuse to make a reasonable accommodation to employees who must wear religiously required garb, such as a yarmulke, a turban, or clothing that meets modesty requirements, or for employees whose faith requires them to wear beards or groom their hair in a certain fashion. Of course, these issues of holy day observance and religious garb and grooming, while accounting for a substantial portion of religious accommodation cases, do not even exhaust the situations in which an employee may be faced with an untenable choice because of an employer's failure to provide reasonable accommodation. Now, if we're talking about those situations where where the force of law is not strong enough to provide for a reasonable accommodation, we have to begin that discussion by noting that, of course, there are many employers who recognize that both they and their employees benefit when they mutually work together to find a fit between the needs of the workplace and the religious obligations of the employee. And again, in listening to the earlier remarks and hearing about the need for flexibility in the workplace, that should not be seen solely as a legal issue. Far from it. If you have the kinds of conciliation and dialogue, efforts on both sides to reach an arrangement that meets the needs of the employee and of the employer, that's the best of all. That's the best of all worlds. That's what should be happening. Is that attempt to work things out so that there is not, at the end of the day, a legal conflict. I'm mindful of the fact that a number of years ago there was a court case which the military was challenged because they refused to allow an Air Force captain to wear a yarmulke or other head covering while he was indoors on duty. They won that case in the Supreme Court of the United States. Congress went forward and passed a law then providing for that kind of accommodation. But perhaps even more important than that is the fact that the military went forward at that point and revisited its regulations so as to provide for accommodation above and beyond what Congress had at that point required of it. So there was the military, which of course places the greatest emphasis on the need for uniformity, for discipline, for doing things in a certain way that's in accord with what the military sees as essential to its needs, and yet they were able to come forward with standards and new regulations that expanded the ability of not employees, but of service members to obtain an accommodation while in the military. So, a fortiori, I would say, or in Hebrew, kal vachomer, if the military could make that kind of accommodation, certainly in the civilian workplace, there should be more of an effort. There can be more of an effort on the part of employers to provide that flexible workplace that allows people to observe their faith. So that's the best situation, is to avoid that need for recourse to the law. But of course, that would put the lawyers out of business, and unfortunately, it's also not going to be the case that that's always so. The EEOC, of course, each year releases reports on the number of claims that are brought for various kinds of discrimination. The number of claims of religious discrimination that the EEOC reports for filing for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2009 totaled 3,386 as compared to 1,449 at the end of the fiscal year 1993, reflecting more than a doubling of claims in that period. And while there were years in which there was a slight dip, basically the number of religious discrimination claims that have been filed each year with the EEOC have gone up steadily over that intervening period. This is by comparison to overall charges that have been filed, where the differential between the numbers of claims filed in fiscal 93 versus fiscal 2009 is something like 10%, perhaps even less than that. And so we see a great difference in kind in terms of the number of religious discrimination claims that have been filed. It's difficult to break out how many of these cases have to do with accommodation as opposed to flat-out facial discrimination, but there is no question that the proportion of accommodation claims as a part of that number is very substantial. And of course, the federal figures do not tell us how many people do not bring claims at all because they are deterred by the weak state of the law, nor do those numbers account for the filings with state and local human rights agencies based on state and local anti-discrimination laws. What we do know is that behind each of these filings, and especially with accommodation claims are at stake, is the story of an American forced to choose between his or her livelihood and faith. Frequently, those who put their faith first suffer catastrophic losses, including their homes, their health insurance, their ability to help their children through college, and in some particularly sad situations, their marriages. Where employers have no good reason for refusing to make a religious accommodation, Americans should not face such a harsh choice. Now, as I've already noted, one of the contributing factors to this rise in claims is the weakness of the accommodation provisions of the law as they're currently interpreted. Under current law, there is little incentive for recalcitrant employers to accommodate the religious beliefs of their employees. This does not deter, in many cases, though, this does not deter people of faith in the workplace from asserting their rights because many of them are unwilling to compromise their conscience, no matter what the legal ramifications might be. But besides the legal issue, I think there are several other sort of meta factors that I think play into why we've seen a rise in the number of claims and the rise in the need to deal with the situation of people who need a religious accommodation. These are the movement towards a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week economy with increased consequent conflicts with religious demands for rest and worship on Saturdays, Sundays, or holidays. Our nation's increasing diversity, marked by a broad spectrum of religious traditions, some of which may clash with workplace parameters that do not take into account the religious observances of immigrant communities. Again, looking at that military situation, you may think you have a uniform, non-discriminatory standard when you're telling people that they can't wear head coverings indoors, but of course, it may be uniform and non-discriminatory in some formal fashion, but the existential impact of that is certainly not the same for all workers. There may be latent animosity towards some religious traditions, as we saw emerge with particular vehemence after 9/11, a phenomenon evidenced by a particularly severe spike in religious claims after the attacks, when Sikh and Muslim Americans faced greater hostility at work, and a growing emphasis on material values at the expense of spiritual ones, with some employers refusing to make any adjustment in workplace practices to allow for religious observance. Here, too, I think, along with what may be the legitimate needs of the workplace, there is sometimes a tendency in the workplace for some employers to basically say, it's my workplace, I'm going to decide what goes here. And they see the effort of employees to seek an accommodation as an intrusion on their prerogatives and their decisions as how the workplace is going to be run. And that shouldn't be acceptable. Where it runs into, in effect, into a situation of discrimination, just as we don't allow those kinds of employer preferences to determine who they're going to hire on the basis of race or gender or any other invidious classification. I just want to note also that, to be sure, beginning in the 1990s, the EEOC and the Justice Department have evidenced a commendable increase in attention to religious discrimination cases, including attention to cases premised on an employer's failure to provide an appropriate accommodation of religious practice. But even with that, their enforcement is limited by the state of the current law and the fact that the courts, and I won't go into all of the legal aspects of this, but the courts have continued, building on a Supreme Court case in the 1970s, have continued to interpret the religious accommodation requirements in a fashion that is very constricted and does not provide an adequate degree of protection. And so for a number of years now, there's been a coalition of more than 40 groups. So you're going to see a number of my colleagues in that coalition are represented and speaking in a few minutes. That has been working, a group of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh groups, conservative and liberal politically, that have come together in an effort to enact a change in the law. WRFA has been introduced in a number of Congresses in a number of forms going back. This will date us to Congressman Steve Solars, who introduced the first version of workplace religious freedom law back something like 20 years ago. The bill has not yet been reintroduced in this Congress, but we're hopeful that we will see that take place soon and in a fashion that will eliminate some of the concerns that have been raised about untoward impacts that some folks at least were concerned would come along with the bill as originally introduced. The federal government is not the only scene of action. States have been widely divergent in their approaches, some with no explicit statute on religious accommodation at all, and with varying degrees on how a general prohibition on religious discrimination should be read. Some states have broad accommodation requirements tracking to a greater or lesser extent the legislation introduced at the federal level, some tracking the current federal law as it's been applied by the courts. Oregon just enacted a WRFA, religious accommodation legislation, that is targeted at holy days, dressing, and grooming, with a similar bill having been introduced in Maryland this year. And action continues on these local fronts, even as cases continue to be brought to seek to clarify and expand upon the protections afforded by state and federal law. So let me just close by observing that nearly 30 years ago, actually it's more than 30 years ago, over 30 years ago, Justice Thurgood Marshall concluded his dissent in Hardison, the case which rolled back the protections that Congress intended in requiring religious accommodation. Thurgood Marshall said, "The ultimate tragedy of this decision is that despite Congress's best efforts, one of this nation's pillars of strength, our hospitality to religious diversity, has been seriously eroded. All Americans will be a little poorer until today's decision is erased." So let us look forward to the day when we realize Justice Marshall's hope that the civil rights laws of this great nation are read so as to give due regard to religious diversity that is one of its marks of pride, and that beyond that, employers bring an attitude of flexibility and openness to finding ways to work with their employees to see that they're able to fulfill both their faith and their obligation to the workplace. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Zainab, will you do us the honor of the next presentation? And as we think about the broader coalition that Richard talked about, there's a number of folks, I'm sure here, who have worked on issues that WRFA helps represent at the federal level. It's interesting, of course, to hear where the states are moving in this area as well as laboratories for democracy. So, Zainab?
Thank you, David, very much, and thank you for the New America Foundation for hosting such an important event to address the issue of religious flexibility at the workplace. It is such an important subject that when we talk about, when I heard the president last week talking about his own experience and the First Lady, that brought a lot of memories to me when I remember when I started looking for a job here in the U.S. when I came 18 years ago. And I remember I went for a job interview, and the woman that was interviewing me was clearly uncomfortable with my headscarf. And at that point, she asked me, "Do you wear your headscarf or that thing in your head only at night or during the day?" And so I told her, "No, I wear my headscarf, whenever I'm in public." And she's like. At that point, I realized that the interview is over after that time. Later on, I started to work at an interfaith refugee ministries and interfaith organization that works as a resettlement arm of the Episcopal Social Service. Many of my clients were individuals fleeing repression in the Muslim world who had came to the U.S. seeking freedom and better life. Some of my clients were experienced discrimination in the workplace because of their religious practices. One woman was asked to change the way that she covered her hair at the work and would be less trouble for some of their customers to see her in a certain way that the employer see. Another man who requested 5 minutes for prayer once a day was declined this right. Denied that right by his employer. At the same time, I did my best to assist them, but found that there was little that I could do. Many years later, I started to I founded the American Islamic Congress, and we started to work on issues related to Islam and the Muslim world, and also working with, as a non-religious civil initiative organization, challenging the negative perception of Muslims by advocating responsible leadership and two-way interfaith understanding. And as a Muslim American thriving amidst American multicultural society and civil liberty in this country, we promote these same values for the global Muslim community. We advocate for women's equality, free expression, and nonviolence. At the same time, this subject become a very important subject as we receive a lot of calls and a lot of complaints from Muslim Americans who've been denied a right to work in their in certain areas or certain offices because of the way they look or they dressed up. This kind of practices, we face it on a daily basis, and we see it, and we feel how many people have been struggling to be able to work freely and to be themselves in their workplace. We make it clear that many Muslim Americans deserve the same equal treatment as all other Americans. We do not want to see our religion used to used to discriminate against us. To be specific, Muslim American women who choose to wear hijab have the right to work with their headscarf. Muslim American workers who choose to pray have the right to conduct their prayers during the work hours. Muslim American who choose to have the right to abstain from handling alcohol or pork, they do have the right to do that. All these personal freedom do not need to disturb American workplace and should be able to integrate in decent way that represent workers of all backgrounds. Representing or respecting workplace diversity, I should add, extend to Muslim employers as well. As part of our two-way understanding, we in the Muslim community need to take practical steps to address discrimination within our own community. Like any other employer, Muslim employers should similarly not discriminate on the basis of gender, race, or religion. There is an enormous religious diversity within the Muslim community, which must be recognized. We Muslim American are very diverse community, Sunni of diverse religious tradition, Shia of diverse religious tradition, enormous little minority sect, and of course people of Muslim heritage who are not religious or not practicing. There is not one way to practice Islam, and the diversity within our community need to be respected. As someone who grew up under oppressive regime, I am originally from Iraq, and religious intolerance, I recognize how precious American freedoms are. As someone who had witnessed some examples of anti-Muslim sentiment in American workplace, I wanted to ensure that both employees and employers work together in an environment of mutual respect. By coming together to promote religious diversity here in the U.S., we will offer a positive example to countries and societies all around the world. And believe me, there are other places that I have witnessed throughout my travel, and I see the discrimination against people of certain religions or certain ethnic background tremendous. And what we are witnessing here in America and what we try to improve doesn't even represent 1 or 2%. We will show how people of diverse religious outlook can work together to advance a tolerance and free society. What can we change as American in this country is not only our work behaviors, but also our work rules and regulations. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Barry.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and again, I just echo the previous speakers in thanking the New America Foundation for hosting us. I represent the Seventh-day Adventist community. The Adventists, of course, has its origins here in the United States, and it's a community that's been very much concerned about the whole issue of religious freedom since its very beginnings. We have a very large established work when it comes to religious freedom. Since about 1893, we officially organized the International Religious Liberty Association, which is still going. Currently in the United States, there are about 1 million Seventh-day Adventists of a community worldwide of about 20 million. And in the American context, we've always struggled with the issue of working on Sabbath. And we keep Sabbath from Friday night sundown to Saturday evening sundown. And in the early days here in the United States, Seventh-day Adventists would be found working on their farms on Sunday, and of course that would be in violation of the blue laws. And some of our members down in Tennessee, for example, were part of chain gangs as a result of hitching up their horse and working on their farm. So that's kind of a little bit of a background of where we come from. And throughout the United States currently, we still find every day we get letters from individuals, emails, and for example, just yesterday I received this email, and she writes to us and she says, "My husband lives in New Orleans. He has been suspended because he won't work on the Sabbath, and he has been on his job for over 8 years, and now there is a problem. Who does he need to get in touch with so that they will either they're going to either fire him or who can we talk to? I know this is very broad, however, this is what's going on in a nutshell." And so she says, "Please, can we have some help?" That is a very common email that we get in our office. We have individuals who, because in the workplace, an employer would say to an Adventist, "Well, why don't you just talk to your pastor and see if the pastor will give you a special dispensation so you can come and work on Saturday?" And of course, it just doesn't work like that. And then the other thing is, well, if you go to church, I'll let you have some time to go to church, but then I want you to come right back. And again, that's not how we keep Sabbath. A Sabbath for the Adventists, very similar to those in the Jewish tradition. There is no work that we do, at least in the regular basis. Now, of course, everyone, and even within Adventism, there's a shades of gray as to what constitutes work and so forth. But from a general perspective, it's a day that we use for going to church, for helping those who are sick and so forth. And that's why, for example, the Seventh-day Adventists have such a large hospital program, because we're very much involved in following the example of Christ, of healing on the Sabbath, as it were. And so the whole medical field is something that the church has been involved with. So we experience this on a weekly basis. Just to give you a feel of what it is that these people experience, I recently got a letter from a chap up in the Northeast, and here's what he said to me as he was telling me of his experience. He said, "They informed me that I had to come into work, and if I did not, I would be deemed absent without leave and would eventually be fired. As you can imagine, I was under great duress and experienced an inordinate amount of stress and anxiety due to the potential loss of employment. At work, I was continually threatened by the administration with the loss of employment and underwent undue pressure from my coworkers and the union to relent and accept the inevitable. This caused me to experience numerous sleepless nights and extreme anxiety during the days that inevitably not only affected me, but also my wife and children. We obviously experienced financial stress during this time, what seemed like an endless weeks of working just 4 days a week. In this case, the employer did allow him to have 4 days a week, but oftentimes they're simply fired. Eventually, this chap was able to get some help. He actually contacted his member of Congress, and the member of Congress wrote a letter on his behalf. And as a result of further negotiation with the employer, he was given back time so that he could work a regular work week. Oftentimes, when we work on these cases, as Richard mentioned, the need of being able to speak with an employer and the employee, having those lines of communication, oftentimes you're able to settle these cases and able to come about a reasonable accommodation And oftentimes it doesn't take much ingenuity, it doesn't take much creativity, especially given the way many workplaces are today. Sometimes work can be brought home and worked on outside of normal hours and so forth. And where there's a willingness, my experience has been is that there's been a way. Anyhow, we just again want to thank you for this opportunity of being here, and I just want to say that there are real people facing real discrimination. And I would suggest that surely the promise of America includes people of all faiths. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Barry. I'd like to introduce Amardeep Singh from the Sikh Coalition. Amar?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll probably first just say that I'm hoping that the webcast isn't in HD because my cup of tea and my shirt had an unfortunate encounter this morning that might show up in an HD type format. While folks are sharing personal anecdotes, my first job actually was the result of a dare that I couldn't get the job because of my turban. I was 16 years old. I had a thriving baseball card business in which I was able to produce income that far exceeded that of my colleagues or my peers who were working for minimum wage somewhere else. I was sort of selling cards and enjoying my summers. But a gentleman who worked with my father said something to the effect, "You're not going to get a job at McDonald's. You're wearing a turban." And I said, "No, you're wrong." So I got that job at McDonald's when I was 16. It was my first job outside of my baseball card business. And it lasted 2 weeks. I was placed on suspension because I had engaged in a Big Mac sauce fight in the afternoon when things were a little slower. Upon completion of the suspension period, I decided to resume the business of selling baseball cards, having proven that I could indeed get a job at McDonald's with my turban. Now, that being said, I would really say, as it pertains to the Sikh and the Muslim community, there are existential questions as to whether there will be space in the public square, and in this case, the workplace, for the practice of our faith and employment. Those critical questions of the application of the law to our particular religious practices are really being decided as we speak. And what's at stake is really whether our communities are going to be ghettoized and marginalized, or we're really going to become part of the workplace is going to be flexible enough. There'll be that universal design that Katie had so eloquently mentioned that will accommodate our communities in the fabric of American society. So I want to actually go through two sort of representative types of cases that we've seen over the past, particularly over the past 10 years. One strand of cases is what we pejoratively call in the office the back of the bus cases. And there are two cases I'd like to hone in on and give you a little bit of the facts so you get a sense of what I mean by back of the bus. One is a case called Beardsley versus United Airlines, and the other case is Ali versus Alamo Rent-A-Car. Now, in both cases, in Ali versus Alamo Rent-A-Car, a Muslim woman who wears a hijab wanted to work at the customer service counter of an Alamo Rent-A-Car. In the Beardsley case, a Sikh wanted to wear his turban at the customer service counter of United Airlines. Now, in both cases, Alamo and United put forth that we have a uniform requirement, a corporate image policy that would not allow for your particular headdress. However, in the sort of colloquy between employer and employee, what we'll do for you is this. You get to wear your turban. You get to wear your hijab. You keep your job. It has the same pay, same opportunity for promotion and the like, but you have to just work in the back outside of public view. So then the question becomes, well, where did the courts land? And in this case, it's a circuit court for the First Circuit, which is sort of the Northeast, and then the Seventh Circuit, which is sort of Chicago, Midwest. In both cases, the court found, using a Supreme Court case versus Ansonia versus Philbrook, they found that any accommodation by the employer that eliminates the religious conflict and sort of gives you these equal material benefits comports with the law. Now, our perspective is these are really back-of-the-bus cases. It says as long as, employers can use people's bigoted impressions of our communities to place people who are undesirable. Perhaps 20, 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, it was African Americans. Sikhs and Muslims are very undesirable-looking people in the public mind in some spheres. So as long as you're out of public view, well, that's completely lawful. So this is a big issue for people in our communities. We constantly receive complaints from Sikhs who are told because of corporate image policies, you're going to have to remove your turban. The accommodation offer you is you can work in the back out of public view, and you'll get the same pay and benefits and the like, but we don't want people to actually see you. This is what I mean by ghettoization, marginalization, outside of the mainstream. And it's a gap area in the law. And right now, the way Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is being interpreted by some circuits, it allows employers and empowers employers to engage in these types of policies. We would, of course, argue that this completely undermines the whole purpose of Title VII, which was integrative. It wanted to bring people together in public, in the mainstream. So that's one strand of cases I wanted to discuss. The other strand of cases that have been troubling for the Sikh community for sure are the cases, as you can imagine, where we're accusing government itself of engaging in discrimination. Because, of course, if government itself engages in discrimination, it sends the wrong message to the rest of society. It says, well, if the United States government can engage in discrimination, why can't I, as an employer, a medium-sized business or a large-sized business, engage in discrimination? So the two cases I'll hone in on, of the many cases I could choose from, are ongoing litigation that our organization's engaging in with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City. Now, in those cases, we have a group of Sikh workers, 6 of them, who have been working for the MTA, Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City, for approximately anywhere from 10 to 30 years. Our lead plaintiff in the case he's not anymore, was the operator of the number 4 train. And on 9/11, the number 4 train, if you're familiar with New York City, used to go into the World Trade Center. The power to that train was cut off once the attacks occurred, and he manually drove his train in reverse to the next station and manually opened the doors and led his passengers to safety. After 9/11, our lead client in this particular case was told, you know what, I know you've worn the turban for the last about 15 years he'd been working for it at the time. Because of 9/11, because of security concerns, because we're concerned that people aren't going to be able to recognize you as an employee of the MTA if there's another terrorist attack, you're going to have to remove your turban. Now he's like, listen, I got an award 6 months after 9/11 for being a hero of 9/11. Are you nuts? What ended up happening was there was a big hullabaloo in the New York media about this matter, and the MTA ended up coming back and saying, you know what, Sikh and Muslim workers, fine, we'll let you wear your hijab, we'll let you wear your turban if you're Sikh, but what we're going to do is this. We're gonna label your hijab or turban, we're going to brand it with our logo, so people know you're sort of the MTA-approved Muslim or the MTA-approved Sikh. And if you can write this retrograde stuff, we've been litigating for now. We filed the lawsuit in March 2004. So we've been litigating this for a good 6 years in federal court and district court in Brooklyn. So that's one matter I wanted to talk about in terms of government discrimination and it really sending the wrong message to the rest of society. The other matter is sort of something you might have seen in the media in the last few weeks. We've been fighting a campaign, and Richard had mentioned discrimination in the Army and a legislative fix that occurred in the mid-'80s to that issue. One of the groups that was left out of this legislative fix with regard to articles of faith in the Army were the Sikhs. Before 1981, Sikhs were able to serve in the U.S. Army and had served in the U.S. Army with distinction in both the World Wars, the Korean conflict, the Vietnam conflict, and the like. They wore their turbans when they were not in a combat situation. When they're in a combat situation, they wore a helmet, or if they needed, they wore a gas mask without any issues. Sikhs were serving in armies all over the world, adequately and well as fine soldiers. But the U.S. Army in 1981, it changed its policy to basically disallow Sikhs. There was a legislative fix as a result of a particularly bad Supreme Court case that was decided in 1985. The legislative fix was in 1986, but the way the Army interpreted the legislative fix was they would not include Sikhs as part of the Army. Now, why is this important to our community? At the end of the day, the Army is America's largest employer. It's America's most prominent employer. The idea that we could be able to serve in the Army freely if someone so chose is sort of essential to sort of integrating yourself into the rest of society. So last year we launched a campaign to reverse what had now been a more than 26-year policy of excluding Sikhs from military service in the Army. And in November of 2009, for the first time in 26 years, the Army had decided to accommodate two Sikhs, a Sikh doctor and a Sikh dentist, and allow them to maintain their turbans and beards in the United States Army. The week after that accommodation, a Muslim doctor who needed to maintain a beard as a result of his faith was also accommodated. The interesting thing is that the Army has made individual accommodations for these gentlemen. They have not changed the overall policy. So if you're Sikh and you want to serve, you still have to file a claim for accommodation. Hopefully, have an organization and lawyers backing you up, and then hopefully you'll be accommodated. But last week, in a bit of good news, our lead client in this sort of Army matter completed basic training. He was in our office yesterday, and we did the full debrief on how basic training went. As basic training is, it was very rough. He was needled quite a bit by his fellow soldiers. Having said that, the base command and the leadership of the Army were thrilled with the experience. They decided of their own volition to write it up, publicize it. NPR and the Associated Press and a whole bunch of the National Press Corps came to his graduation, and the Army ended up actually featuring his story on the front page of its website all last week. They still haven't changed the policy, though. We're still working on that issue. But these issues of government discrimination are critical for our community in terms of prioritizing what to address. Because, again, if government can discriminate, it sends a wrong message to private employers, whether it's the MTA trying to brand our turbans or it's the U.S. Army not being able to understand that there actually is no conflict with service and maintaining our faith, and it actually strengthens our forces abroad so that we're sort of embodying the values that we're preaching at home. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Siobhan.
And now Nathan Diamond. Nathan?
Good afternoon. I guess I'm in the role of the cleanup hitter, so I'm going to try to draw together a few of the threads and themes that have been mentioned so far, and look forward to the discussion we'll have after. We started by commenting on how last week the White House brought this issue to prominence with their Workplace Flexibility Conference, and I think a lot of what's not been said in the discussion but has been implicit is that a lot of the problems that are present in American society really come from a lack of information and frankly ignorance, or at least unfamiliarity, that does not allow employers or other people in the workplace to have the information they need to try to engage in the conversation and be willing to accommodate the needs. I'm sure this is the case on the family work balance side, and it's true in the religious accommodation context as well. You know, just like last week, the Obamas talked about their work-life balance stories, and that was educating the public. So last week, the president held a Passover Seder, which was circulated in the mainstream media, and a photo of them sitting around dipping their fingers into a cup of wine, commemorating the 10 plagues that were visited upon the Egyptians. And that was a really wonderful thing. But everybody, so to speak, knows that there's a Seder on Passover. Some people even know that there's two outside of Israel. And in fact, last year, a number of us commented that the Obamas held their Seder on the second night of Passover. That was a very educational experience for a lot of people, to let them know that in the diaspora from Israel there are two Seders. But as Richard was alluding to in his opening remarks, not so many people know that there's a seventh day of Passover and an eighth day of Passover on which observant Jews desist from work and have these workplace conflicts and need an exception. So that's one aspect of more information and better information that needs to get out there. It reminds me of a case that came up in the workplace accommodation context several years ago involving an employer that we all know, Sears. Sears has, among its many services that it will offer you, an appliance repair fleet. So if you buy your washer, dryer, oven, refrigerator, or what have you, that you've seen on Extreme House Makeover, and you think that the Kenmore brand is the best thing for you, you'll go to Sears and you'll buy it. And then there might be a problem, and they'll send someone out to you. Well, several years ago, some Orthodox Jews and Seventh-day Adventists applied to Sears to be appliance repairmen. And Sears up front said, no, I'm sorry, we'd love to hire you, but come on, everybody wants their dishwasher fixed on a Saturday because that's when they're home. And so we couldn't possibly work it out that you, Seventh-day Adventists and Orthodox Jews, with your Saturday Sabbath observance, you can't do the job. To make a long story short, the New York State Attorney General got involved, a whole bunch of our organizations got involved, and one of the benefits from having the New York State Attorney General involved is they looked at Sears records, and lo and behold, the most requested day for appliance repair calls from Sears was not Saturday, it was Tuesday. So Sears didn't even have enough information about its own business practices to know whether or not the assertion they were making about whether or not they could accommodate these Saturday Sabbath observers was accurate or not. So not only is there education needed in the public at large, not only is there education and information needed by people who might be mid-level managers or other coworkers working side by side with people that need religious accommodation. The highest echelons of the American business community, the American employer community, need to know what their own business practices are and need to be prodded to understand how their businesses and practices can or cannot be suitable for accommodation. We spent a lot of time speaking about scheduling issues, especially with regard to full days, and I just want to emphasize one point that applies in the observant Jewish community, and Barry alluded to this as well, and that is we think about holy day observances as sort of a full 12-hour or 24-hour package, whether it's a Saturday Sabbath or a devout Catholic who wants to take off for Good Friday or Christmas Day, et cetera, et cetera. There are also issues for various faith communities or their adherents that come up with much smaller bites of the day that need to engage in prayers during the course of a workday. If you need to, in the Jewish faith or in the Muslim faith, need to pray a particular prayer, and the only time you can pray it falls, let's say, between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., the ability of accommodations to occur so that they have the time, which is generally not a very lengthy amount of time, but a time and a place in the workplace where they could engage in that is important as well. We've also talked a lot about clothing and appearance issues, but we would be remiss if we didn't mention one other category of issues which comes up in this context, which is conscience issues. And those come up for different people of different faiths in different contexts. Perhaps the most striking and frankly politically charged aspect where this comes out is conscience issues having to do with women's health care. And perhaps this most prominently and most saliently came to the fore back in November in the much followed and much contested Senate race up in Massachusetts between Scott Brown and Martha Coakley. And the weekend before the election, candidate Coakley was doing a radio interview on some Boston radio talk show. And healthcare issue generally, as you might recall, healthcare policy had been a debate in that Senate race. And Scott Brown, as a state senator, had proposed amendments to Massachusetts' state healthcare legislation several years back, which would have provided rights of conscientious objection to healthcare workers in Massachusetts. And in the course of a debate between Brown and Coakley, Coakley attacked Brown for his proposed amendments, asserting that they went much further than accommodating the conscience of those doctors or nurses or what have you, that they went so far as they might interfere with the ability of women to obtain legal health care services. So this radio talk show host brought this up to candidate Coakley, and she defended her position. And then he asked her, well, what about if you're a devout Catholic who has a very devout pro-life point of view? What are you supposed to do? And Martha Coakley, who, by the way, was, I guess still is, serving as Attorney General in the state of Massachusetts, said, well, if you're a devout Catholic, you probably shouldn't be working in a hospital or certainly not in an emergency room. And this was striking to me, at least. I think to some others for two reasons. One, in Massachusetts, you don't want to really write off the Catholic vote. Maybe that was part of her problem in terms of how the election played out. The other thing about it was, and talk about a lack of information, Massachusetts at the state level has actually one of the best religious accommodation laws in the country, and has a specific provision that talks about balancing religious accommodation in the workplace with exigent circumstances, including health, not explicitly, but it would include healthcare workers and emergency room situations and so on and so forth. And you would think that the Attorney General of the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, whose office is responsible for enforcing those laws, would know that the state of Massachusetts actually has a very fine model law. And so at all levels, my message would be, whether it's on the government and law enforcement side, on the public generally, in the employer community, and in the employee community in terms of what people's rights are and what they ought to ask for and not ask for, so to speak, there's a lot more information and education that needs to go on. And so it's great, again, that the New America Foundation is having this fine program and that we're contributing to that educational enterprise today. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. I wanted to thank all of our speakers and invite them all to come forward. We have we'll have a bit of a packed house here, but an opportunity for dialogue with you all here as all of them come forward here. I have to say that if flexibility were the standard of the American workplace, not the exception, I think it could help resolve many of the conflicts that we see in work and life. And that would certainly include religious life. And so the question then comes to my mind about, well, how would we increase the flexibility of the workplace? And from your own experiences, I'll just ask this one question and then open it up here. I'm thinking about the different factors that might increase that flexibility and what might be the best way to think about doing that. Nathan mentioned education, and I think about the understanding of employers of the diversity of the American workforce. Another option is just, we want to nationally try to increase more discussion between employers and employees to work out arrangements on an individual basis. The role of legislation and litigation has come up already, and that's significant. And then creative approaches to job scheduling and job sharing or other activities might help relieve some of them. And we've heard about the role of technology, which can make things easier or harder, as the case may be on work life, and that's the case in terms of religion as well. I'd be interested if anyone, we don't need everyone need to answer it, but if anything comes to mind about the right way forward that would increase the general flexibility of the workplace in America, which I think would be beneficial for anyone who has got a work-life conflict, but particularly in terms of religion. If there's one thing that the country should do, if you were at that White House forum, you were the president last week, and you could have taken one step forward, would it have been in the education realm or the legislative realm, or is there something that you think would be the first and highest priority that would increase the flexibility of American workplaces? Richard?
Well, I would just observe, actually, that would no doubt very fine program of the White House was held on one of those days of Passover when at least observant Jews are not permitted to work. So I think education is a piece of it. To the extent the issue of religion was not part of the conversation at that particular time, I think that's an illustration of the need for us all to move that issue forward and for it to be there fully at the table along with all of the other important issues for which we need workplace flexibility. And part of that package, I just want to say also, you've really enumerated many of the kinds of ways that we would want to go. I do think that the role of legislation is crucial here, not because we need more lawsuits, but because we need fewer. And there's somebody who works in this area who's been litigating religious accommodation cases since before the Civil Rights Act was amended, and since before that awful Hardison case in the Supreme Court. And his name's Lee Boothby, and what Lee reports to us is that before the Hardison case came down, there were actually fewer cases being brought because when people went to their lawyers, or rather when employees went to their lawyers, they were being told, yes, you need to take this seriously, you need to accommodate. Once it became more the case that there was not such an obligation to accommodate, employers started getting different kinds of advice from their lawyers, that they really didn't have to go very far. So I think what we need to do is see a change in the law that will change the framework so that conversation is more likely to take place both in a public forum and when people are going to seek counsel as to what they do or don't have to do. And that taken together will be very helpful in terms of providing a better result in terms of finding a way to accommodate religiously observant employees.
Thank you, Richard. Any other comments before we open it up?
Again, Katie Corrigan from Workplace Flexibility 2010. I think one thing I just wanted to make clear, and this is something that actually inside our project we spent a lot of time almost doing Venn diagrams of how our issues intersect with other issues. And one area that we spent a lot of time on was this issue around civil rights law. And so I just wanted to kind of have an asterisk that, when you're talking about civil rights issues, which is really what we heard a lot of today, historically, constitutionally, legally, I almost feel like there's, they stand on their own, or there's kind of a bubble there. And so all of those legal issues that you heard about, we've taken a look at, and all we tried to do was sort of say, where is the overlay? And I almost feel like when I talk about the universal design concept, it's like eliminating the brush, right? I agree with Nathan that absolutely one thing we found, a lot of this is about information. When you're trying to manage a workforce from a business perspective, the main message we have is the baseline has shifted. And best practice companies get that. Their baseline doesn't look like it used to be. Diversity is the norm. So whether it's because of religious practice, as Michelle Obama mentioned last week, and I thought this was very powerful, she showed up to a job interview pushing a stroller with her kid in it. So that was also one of those signals when we heard about some of the issues today. One of the signals of, well, what kind of employee are you going to be? Are you going to be there when I need you? You're going to be able to work as hard as I need you to? And in her case, it turned out well, as it did for you at McDonald's, but it turned out well, and they hired her. But she realized that was tricky, and she realized there was an element of privilege and luck there. And that, again, it shouldn't be a surprise when someone has caregiving responsibilities at home. It shouldn't be a surprise when someone has a religious practice issue that they need to deal with. That's the norm now. So I think of workplace flexibility as, again, clearing away some of the brush. There will be, however, some core cases, and the civil rights laws obviously are key for that. But I feel like workplace flexibility can kind of eliminate at least the easy cases, again, and I would say through definitely education. What we heard again and again, educating line managers. If you can get to them, you actually will shift a lot. But again, that's not the only thing. I mean, we look at this as a diverse issue that's going to need a diverse set of policy tools. Sometimes there may need to be a labor standard in certain instances, but what we found is there's also a lot you can do through education, training, even the bully pulpit, and shifting cultural awareness. But I think it's going to be essentially all of the above, David.
Yeah. Very good. All right, thank you. Let's see if we have any question and discussion perspectives from those of you who are here today. on questions from folks who are working in particular areas representing different communities, working generally across lines, or comments you might have on from your perspective, what's the right mix of steps forward for our country to think about the flexibility of American workplaces and to respect the increasing diversity of our workforce. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir. Do we have a mic? I'm sorry to interrupt your session, only because we want the mic for no reason. All the people on the internet can hear you.
Okay.
And introduce yourselves if you wouldn't mind. Sorry.
My name is Lance Walker. I work in the Office of Public and International Affairs for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. A few of you have touched on federal court cases. You've talked about the legislative effort at the federal level, and you've also touched on some state laws. I'm curious to get I just want a little bit more insight about the state laws, if there are positive trends or negative trends, and if states were to take up enact effective legislation, do you think having effective state laws would address the issues in an effective way?
Mm-hmm. Any takers for the question?
Okay. Well, the answer is at the state level, as I alluded to in my earlier remarks, are all over the place. There are states that have moved forward. New York, a number of years ago, adopted a strong legislation which is similar in many respects to the federal legislation that's been passing for a number of years that provided a broad, higher standard in terms of the protection afforded to people that need an accommodation in the workplace. New Jersey has done something similar. Oregon, on the other hand, has recently strengthened its accommodation law, but for certain categories of religious practices, grooming, dress, and holy days. So the answer is that the states are, as I think our moderator alluded to earlier, the laboratories of democracy, and different states adopt different approaches. Some states have not done anything at all in terms of having explicit religious accommodation legislation, and then the question arises whether the existing anti-discrimination law implicitly requires accommodation, because the failure to provide at least a reasonable accommodation is a form of discrimination. I do think it's very important to move forward at the state level. First of all, we still don't have the strength in federal law that we would like to have, and there may be gaps ultimately that a state law could deal with. And in addition, state laws often cover smaller employers that federal law does not reach. So there's a lot of reason to continue to look to the states as places where protections could be provided, while at the same time moving forward at the federal level.
Very good. Thank you. All right. Any other questions? We'll have a question here and then the lady over here. So.
Hi, I'm Michael Rose. I'm a reporter with BNA's Daily Labor Report, and I wanted to ask Mr. Fulton if you could go into a little bit more detail about proposed federal legislation and even maybe a timetable of when or who you might expect to introduce it, if you can say that, or what the past legislation has said, and do you expect any future legislation to be similar?
Well, the chief sponsors for a number of years in the House have been Congresswoman McCarthy and Congressman Souter, and in the Senate, Senator Kerry has been carrying that as well as there have been Republican supporters and other Democratic supporters as well. There's been no legislation introduced this year. There are efforts to revisit and rework legislation that's been introduced in prior years. We're hopeful to actually see legislation introduced, but it's a work in progress. But in the meantime, I can say that in earlier iterations, what basically the Workplace Religious Freedom Act, which has been the chief vehicle, would have done would have been to strengthen change the interpretation of undue hardship, that partisan case I've been alluding to, provided that anything more than a de minimis difficulty or expense is an undue hardship. And they taught me on the first day of law school that de minimis means ain't much. So it wasn't much of a protection. It was some. I certainly don't want to suggest there aren't people that people certainly went to court, they went to the OAC, and they won cases in seeking accommodation from time to time, quite a number of times, but still not the kind of protection we would like to see. What WRFA in its earlier forms would have done would have been broadly to say undue hardship means a significant difficulty or expense, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act standard. And as well also would have provided for a reinterpretation of what's a reasonable accommodation. You had cases in which the courts would look at a proposed accommodation in which, for instance, a Sabbath observer was told, well, you only need to come in one Sabbath out of 4, and which means the person was going to be out of work in 3 weeks. One other change that WRFA provides is to provide that it can't be reasonable accommodation if it doesn't resolve the conflict between the requirements of faith and the workplace. That doesn't mean it might still be an undue hardship for the employer, and the employer gets to make that case, but the proposed accommodation to be reasonable has to at least meet that test. So that's been the version of WRFA that's been introduced, Workplace Religious Freedom Act, that's been introduced a number of times, and as I say, it may be introduced in somewhat different form in the coming weeks.
Very good. All right. I think we had a question here.
Well, I have two, if it's okay. One is
Yeah, introduce yourself just for folks on the internet.
My name is Sadia. I have two, if it's okay. The first is that what kind of flexibility arrangements can be made for mothers to help them, like, balance their job responsibilities and their motherhood?
Mm-hmm.
And the other is that I think for Muslims and maybe for other people, there are already accommodations that sometimes are allowed for praying, but sometimes a person could like walk in a room and not know what the person is doing, and kind of make an awkward situation. So you need a balance between privacy, like a limited audience, but also like understanding, okay, this person's covering their hair now they're not. Maybe like Zainab could answer that question. What do you think could be done for that?
Okay. I might tackle the first one for a second. Katie might have a thought, or others as well. But in my impression, some of the things that have traditionally we think about as helping mothers in the workforce are also beneficial to fathers and to really all workers. And the three buckets that some of Katie's work has done have been very helpful to me in thinking about your question in terms of mothers. So when someone needs maternity leave or short and then extended time off, to have an ability to be at home as we think about maternity leave, that extended time off is an important component. When someone might come back to work, to think about systemically, we think about a career maintenance or reentry program and some accommodation that would allow for someone to then reenter the workforce after they've taken some extended time to have a child. And then, as Katie mentioned, Michelle Obama's example of bringing the child to her interview, you get the job. You still have the child. I have a child who's 1 and one who's almost 4, and I sort of think about balancing my life with my wife who's worked as well. We think about flexible work arrangements and what do they mean in terms of our family to be able for my wife to be with our 2 small children and for myself to be there. And those flexible work arrangements in terms of flexible scheduling and job sharing, telecommuting are there. If I could, just to promote some of the work that Katie and Workplace Flexibility 2010 has done is on their website in the 3 areas that I had suggested, and I have found that, and you might as well find that very helpful when we're thinking about what can be done to help mothers in the workforce. So that's I'd go to their website for some specifics. Anything else?
I'll just give 3 examples, and I think David is correct that companies that have done this well often do flexibility in a way that, again, is kind of as universal as possible. So, for example, on flexible work arrangements, oftentimes they don't care what the reason is that you need the flexibility, but they have sometimes a process by which you can go and request a flexible schedule and discuss that with your manager to see what would work. Sometimes in the hourly context, they have things as basic as shift swapping and making sure that there's a clear way to do that. So again, whether you're salaried or hourly and in different industries, there's been lots of different examples of how this can work, and again, for a range of reasons. And in terms of time off, I think that is one area where traditionally those have been targeted to a need. So for example, a maternity or paternity leave, or even for sick days. although now some companies have been moving more towards a generalized pot of time. So whether you need it for a sick day or whether you need it for a Sabbath, you have the flexibility to take it off and not have it designated for a specific type of need. But those are just some examples. And one last piece on that last bucket of career flexibility, Deloitte is a big consulting firm. They came up with an idea called mass career customization, where rather than thinking about the career track as you have a full-time job and therefore you have these job opportunities and possibilities for advancement, or you have a part-time job and you're in this bucket, they think of it as dialing up, so that there are some points in career where you're going to be working more hours, and you're also going to be going up the trajectory quicker. Sometimes in your career you're going to dial down, so it might slow down the trajectory, but it doesn't knock you off the partnership track, for example. I think that concept is very helpful in thinking about, again, I think that can be applied to lots of different types of jobs, but this idea that you're going to be dialing up in some moments and then dialing down is another popular one.
We had a second question here.
Yep.
Well, it's a matter of explanation for the, if you're talking about the person who needs to pray in the workplace, and I'm sure there are private room for employees, or a kitchen or a place where they eat, and that person can practice this kind of, can practice his prayers only take 5 minutes or so, and many employers, certainly I will do that when I have some of my employees who go and smoke, for example, and sometimes smoking when they go down in the buildings takes about 5 minutes, sometimes more. If there is a company of 3 or 4 other people smoking in the same place, and so prayer is the same thing. I think people should have the right to do that in their workplace, and they can have private area or private room covered or not covered, and this thing should be discussed and explained between the employer and the employee. I don't think it's such a big deal to explain their religious preferences and to have to practice in this place.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Do we have a question here?
Irene Schindler with the National Alliance for Caregiving.
Sure. Yeah, Irene.
Irene Schindler with the National Alliance for Caregiving. Just talking about workplace flexibility, I guess my question is to everybody on the panel, how optimistic are you that things are going in the right direction with regard to flexibility in general? Because some of the research that we've been doing for caregiving, and there are about 66 million American family caregivers, they're feeling, because of the economic downturn, very concerned about asking for accommodations, asking for time off, asking for anything. And in this digital age, everyone's working longer. Everyone's doing work at home and in the office in longer hours. So I guess I'm just kind of interested, are you feeling optimistic or hopeful, or how's the business community reacting, or do you see signs, or is this a loaded question?
But let's see.
I just from our community's perspective, we've certainly seen over the last several months a big increase of people contacting us seeking accommodation. So there's no question that the economy is definitely playing a role on this. But, human nature is such that we always are hopeful, and we hope that things turn around. But there's no question, at least in our community, we have definitely seen an increase. Request.
And that was something at last week's White House Forum that came up several different times. And at least from the business audience at that forum, there was a pretty strong affirmation that the reason they do flexibility isn't just because it's a nice thing to do, but rather there is a bottom line case for it. So I think that companies that sort of know how to do it well, that have training in place for their managers, continue to see payoffs even during a time of recession. So I don't think you've seen a big drop in terms of the use of flexibility from companies. On the flip side, I did hear very clearly in that same forum that folks from the employee perspective were saying there is a fear of being different or asking for something more than the norm. And again, just kind of going back to that baseline point, if we can shift the baseline so it's not an anomaly to ask for flexibility, but rather the norm, I think that will help certainly destigmatize and hopefully make people feel less afraid. Now, I think that what the White House started last week was a much bigger conversation about the role of public policy in helping the private sector move forward. And I think there are obviously lots of different tools the government can use, but one administration official used an image that I thought was a really nice one, which is what the government can do is when you see a problem, some companies have been doing great, right? You've got lots of good examples of best practice companies. What the government can do is kind of help everybody jump together to solve a problem. And I think that, again, I'm optimistic because I think last week what the government did was start to connect the dots. And again, it's all about the demographics. You know, it's women in the workplace, it's the caregiving. I mean, the numbers that you guys have produced in caregiving are so striking. The aging of the population, the needs, desires, and wants of our younger generation. I mean, there's just lots of pressure on this issue right now. So I am optimistic in light of the economy. And the last reason is that the White House squarely placed this as part of our economic recovery. It's not at odds. It's actually one of the tools to get us there.
Oh, I'm thankful to Katie for making me more optimistic.
I can tell you now.
I think Katie and I are going to have therapy sessions every few months so I can be more optimistic. We're really, from my perspective, the way that the rules are set up right now as it pertains to Sikh and what I've observed with Muslim practices, I feel like we're sort of fighting a battle with like with football bats. The rules are just stacked up against us right now in a way that really does empower employers to say, as Richard had put it, ain't much. It's a very low burden to overcome. And I think, I've been sort of thinking about this idea that Nathan and Katie have put forth with regard to education. But I think at the end of the day, it's really important, Katie's alluded to this, that the baseline be where it needs to be. And that's where the changes in the law are going to probably be helpful in creating the right baseline. And then, yes, of course, employers will be educated and will sort of have to educate the other employees, the sort of the heads of the companies, as to what the baseline is. But I think unless we see movement on some legislation, it's going to be, at least as it pertains to our community, we're really fighting an uphill battle that I've observed personally over the last 10 years of doing this particular work. But thank you, Katie.
Yes, no, I think the thing that's funny is I think that we're both talking about the same line in the sand, and I'm trying. The optimistic part is this is a starting point, but absolutely, this has been a long struggle. So I hear both sides.
The policy part of me, I think this is a great question for us to end on as we get to 1:30 from Irene, because the public policy hat of mine. I'm so enthusiastic about what happened last week at the White House that, as well as what happens on the legislative front, it opens up an avenue for this particular issue to be part of a broader context. And I think that's always helpful. And as older workers and as women and as fathers and as religious Americans, as we all work on different aspects, people come together and change happens when people come together. Putting on my pastor's hat for a second, your question around the 24/7 economy, one thing that religious Americans do of a variety of backgrounds is remind us that there is more to our life than work. And employers are also, in many cases, religious people as well. And as people start turning to the tools of their faith, whatever that is, to remind them that there are other things in creation other than work, it does help people then to think about how they might make space for those things in their life and therefore in their employees' lives. So I think there's an important witness that goes on by the policy work of religious communities that connects people to things that help create those kind of spaces. So let's take a break and adjourn. But before we do, will you join me in thanking our six panelists for being with us today. I appreciate your being with us and watching today.